Hey everyone, welcome back to yet another episode of SAFT Podcast, and I am super excited that you are joining us in this very special episode. Now, if you have been a regular listener to the podcast, you do know that we have been one, covering the natural theology series, two, we have been recently going through the moral argument, and three, as we've seen previously, we conclude each argument at the end with a very unique guest interaction that helps us to get into some of the topics, crevices of the content, and objections that we may not be able to address within the previous session. And we always bring in a world leading expert to do that. Now, we have had Dr. William Lane Craig on the podcast a couple of times in the past, but I could not think about a better person to bring on as we come to the conclusion of the moral argument than our guest today, Professor Dave Baggett. Professor Dave, it's a true delight to have you on SAFT Podcast for the very first time.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
And so to our audience, if you are wondering why do we have this guest interaction, what is the moral argument, and as such, I would really encourage you to go back and check in what we've been covering for the past couple of, well over a couple of episodes on SAFT Podcast. And to just give you a recap on what we're trying to do here, well, as you know, to our regular listeners, we've been going through the moral argument, and we've been going through a very specific version of the moral argument. As you're aware, we are presenting this natural theology series as a resource to help you in your journey trying to understand the natural theology, the arguments for God's existence, and we've been building the whole series off of Dr. William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. So it serves as a good textbook for you to go back and read and get to grasp with it, grapple with it much more, while the podcast serves as a good learning and helpful aid in that process. Now, in Dr. Craig's work, Dr. Craig advances a very specific version of the moral argument, a deductive version of the moral argument. Now, you can check back in our previous episode where we break down the difference between deductive and inductive and abductive approaches. And so Dr. Craig presents a deductive version of the moral argument. And you might have memorized it already by now, but the format is that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2 states that objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, the conclusion is that God exists. Now, this is just one version of the moral argument, but there are way more different versions of the moral argument. So we're going to look in a very specific version of the moral argument that Professor Dave Baggett and his colleague has been advancing, which I believe is quite convincing and also has its own strength when we engage in the process of sharing the gospel and sharing the case for classical theism. And so, Professor Dave, I think that serves as a good prelude for us to jump right in. But before we move a bit further, maybe a lot of our audience may be wondering, seeing your face, and they would be wondering, well, why haven't I heard about Dr. Dave Baggett? What does he do? Where is he working? Is he a philosopher? Where is he teaching? So if you could give us a quick intro to our audience on who we have here with us, that'd be excellent.
Okay, sure. Yes, I'm Dave Baggett. I teach at Houston Christian University in Houston, Texas, in the United States. Before that, I taught for 14 years in Virginia, and before that, for 4 years in Pennsylvania at different colleges. And this is my fourth year here. My wife and I moved here in 2020. And I teach philosophy, and she teaches literature. And I direct the Center for the Foundations of Ethics here at Houston Christian. And in the moral argument was way back when I was working on my PhD, I wrote my dissertation on the topic of God and ethics. And that got me going, and I've just sort of continued down that path. And I wasn't originally working on the moral argument for God's existence. I was instead answering objections and that sort of thing to this idea that God and ethics are somehow tied together. But in time, I realized that that was one of the pieces I needed to construct the moral argument. And so I've been working on the other pieces. And with my colleague, Jerry Walls, we have written quite a bit on this topic. And we're actually finishing up a tetralogy. That's a 4-book series on the moral argument. So first we wrote Good God, and then we wrote God and Cosmos. Then we wrote a history of the moral argument. And I happen, just by sheer coincidence, to have the manuscript of the fourth book in the series. I still have to finish the last chapter. Not quite done, but close. After all those years, that's finally going to be drawing to an end. But that's what got me interested and excited about thinking about this topic of God and ethics.
Wow, excellent. Now, if I recall right, I know that Dr. William Lane Craig also teaches a course in conjunction with you at Houston Christian University. Does Mary Jo Sharp still serve within the faculty at Houston?
Mary Jo, was here for several years, and from what I understand, this was her last year, and she'll be moving on to some other things. But she's a marvelous friend, and she was a wonderful colleague. I hate to see her go, but I'm sure that God has great plans for her.
Yeah,
and you're right. William Lane Craig and I did a course together on the moral argument here, and that was a lot of fun, because he had his approach and I had mine. But I think what I really took out of that experience most of all is, besides just how wonderful he is as a man and as a thinker, it's not how much we agree on, despite some differences in our approaches. But we agree on a whole lot more than we disagree.
Yeah, and our audience will recollect Mary Jo Sharp, whom we've had on the podcast in the past. So again, yet another episode for you to check back in our history. Now, I just want to get to know a bit about how this conjunctive course that you did with Dr. Craig came about to be. What was the lead up to it? Like, how did that come up? Because you both have different approaches to the moral argument. Now, in a bird's eye perspective, you would say, well, it goes hand in hand, enabling the body of Christ, enabling Christians to advance the case. But in a very philosophical sense, these are quite drastically different approaches, and obviously there would be different criticism to different approaches within that philosophical engagement. So how did you and Craig come together to do this course, and what was the key driving factor behind it?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think a lot went back to a book panel discussion that was held out in California after the publication of our first book in that tetralogy, Good God. And we had at an Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting, we had a book panel discussion with me and Craig, and with my co-author Jerry Walls and Paul Copain. So it was the four of us. Yeah, and it was a lot of fun. It was organized by my old dear friend, Mark Foreman. And we went for about 3.5 hours discussing that book and had a great time. And we discussed some differences in our approaches, but also resonated on so many issues. It was a wonderfully collegial time of interaction. And so I think my guess is since then we've sort of been in discussion about these matters. And then when I came to Houston Christian, somebody had the idea, either me or my dean, Phil Talon. It was somebody. Maybe Craig and I could co-teach a class. So he comes to school once a term for an intensive week and teaches sort of like a little mini course. But this was going to be a full-fledged course that we would fit into 2 weeks. So very intensive. And largely he would teach the first half and then I would teach the second half. And that was just a lot of fun. And we thought it would be a fruitful way to compare and contrast our approaches. And it was actually at the end of that course that I broached with Craig the idea that maybe we could work on a book together, he and I, where we sort of integrate our approaches. And especially, again, I think because what we came to see is that we agreed on a lot more than we disagreed. The differences are interesting, and they're interesting to think about and discuss, and I'm happy to do that for sure. But I just don't want that point to be lost, that we agree on so much And the disagreement largely has to do with how best to sort of couch the argument. But in terms of the content of what it is that we believe, there's quite a bit of overlap.
And what's interesting is that for a person with an acute philosophical mind, they would look at this interaction. They would look at you engaging with Dr. Craig's version, Dr. Craig engaging with your version, and exchanging what is a strength, what is a weakness, and they would be really fascinated by those differences, and they would really want to get into it. But for folks like us who are, we're not full-time philosophers, we would say, "Oh wow, another powerful argument for God's existence. That's cool." And so that's the way we would look at it. So that's excellent. And so in the new book where you and Dr. Craig are working together, does it look like you're going to get a combined version, a novel approach to the moral argument, or would that be too much to hope for?
Yeah, it remains to be seen how it plays out exactly. What I suspect is what we'll try to do is draw on the strengths of both approaches, and where there are limitations in either, maybe that's where their integration will be able to address some of those deficiencies. And together, the hope is we'll be able to offer a more full-board kind of approach.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so I know that our audience may be quite at the edge of their seat to figure out, okay, what is this approach? What is Professor Dave Baggett's approach to moral argument? Now, hold on, we will get into it. But before we move into that, could you give us a very brief overview of the different approaches to the moral argument? And I will be dropping a link in the description to an article on Professor Dave's site, Moral Apologetics. That is, I would say, your one-stop destination for the moral argument, where he lists out the syllogism, the content of different approaches to the moral argument. But for someone who's just familiar with, Dr. Craig's version, to give them an overview, what are the different approaches to the moral argument? And we will get into yours right after that.
Sure, absolutely. Right. So you mentioned Craig's approach. So why don't I start with that one, and then I'll sort of show how we can deviate from that in certain respects. Because when we talk about different versions of the moral argument, there are two different ways in which you can lay out various versions. One is by altering the content a little bit, and then the other one is to alter the way in which it's couched, right? Logically. And so his version, like you said before, is, right, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, but they do exist. So God exists. So that's what's called, as you've all been discussing, from what I understand, a deductive approach, where the conclusion follows from the premises. So such that if the premises are true, that the conclusion has to be true. And that's a big draw for people. People like that, right? They often with my students, they'll say, boy, I just appreciate that deductive approach because it kind of gives you that airtight kind of case, right? And it's pithy and it's succinct. And I think it works really well, especially in abbreviated contexts, time-wise, right? You're in a debate. You have to give a succinct version of the argument, and then you have a little bit of time to discuss it. But you have to figure out a way to be fairly concise, and that's an effect. I think why it has served him so well in debate contexts, and of course he's a master debater. So this is the kind of thing that he does quite a lot of, and he uses that version of the argument to great effect. In fact, he had this is not his favorite argument. That's probably the Kalam cosmological argument, which he loves so much. But he has said this is the argument that he has has seen the most success as he has been out on college campuses, sharing it and things like that. And I find that to be really encouraging and tremendously telling. So I celebrate that, altogether celebrate that. So what he has here is two premises and a conclusion. So I mentioned the two different ways that you can depart. One is the content. So his content has to do, the moral evidence he's pointing to objective moral values and duties, right? Objective moral values and duties. So this largely has to do with the distinction between the good and the right, the good and the right. So good has to do with value, and right typically has to do with moral duties, moral obligations. So this is what he's talking about: objective moral values and duties. And objective in the sense that, they're not dependent upon human opinions and things like that. So if something is a universal binding moral duty, then it is for you and it is for me and it is for everyone else, irrespective of our, particular preferences or desires or sentiments or what have you. So that's the content: objective moral values and duties. And that's one way to do it. But you could also talk about is either instead of those things or in addition to them, other aspects, other moral evidences that you might wish to point to. And there's a whole laundry list, right? You might talk about moral freedom. If we have such a thing as that's a piece of moral evidence that is in need of explanation. Or you might talk about rights, like basic human rights, or you might talk more specifically about what kinds of values that you're discussing. So, for example, you might talk about inherent human value, right? Inherent human value. So not just moral values in general, right? But many of us have a deep sense of the value of human beings, right? We are inherently or intrinsically valuable, perhaps even infinitely so. And as such, we possess, inalienable human rights, all of us, because of our value. Immanuel Kant said we have this kind of value. It's not the same as a price. It's a value that can't be negotiated or compromised. Well, that's a powerful piece of moral evidence. So I like this bit about the good and the right, about objective moral values and duties, and I actually include that in my approach. But I also extend the case, and I talk about basically 4 pieces of evidence, of which objective moral values and duties are one. But I also talk about moral knowledge, which carries its own sort of interesting features and challenging features to explain, especially for our naturalist friends and such. And then I talk about the 2 aspects of what John Hare calls moral faith. One is that there is a basic correspondence between doing the morally good and right thing and our own self-interest, that ultimately there's an airtight case. It's never going to go against your self-interest ultimately to be a virtuous person, a person of integrity and such. And that has a long history in ethics of people believing it from a variety of perspectives. But I happen to think that a theistic worldview can explain that conspicuous convergence or coincidence or correspondence very well. And then the last thing that I focus on is that second piece of what John Hare calls moral faith, and this derives from Immanuel Kant, and it's this idea that morality requires us to live at say, this level here. And the best that we can do is something below that, right? We all know this from our personal experience, that we fall short in all manner of ways, living up to the moral law. So try as we might, we fall short. So we have this deep intuitive sense that there is such a moral law, and that has to do with those moral values and duties. But we also experientially know the reality of falling short of that standard. And then what do you do with that standard? And I think a theistic worldview, especially a Christian worldview, it provides an impeccable explanation of what to do with that gap, why it's there, and how it can be closed by God's grace. And so that holds out the hope for extending the moral argument to something maybe more distinctively Christian. And the basic idea is that by God's grace, we can be gradually changed. transformed, made holy, sanctified, conformed to the image of Christ, all those things, right? All those images point to this idea of the closing of that moral gap. Because otherwise, you've got this moral gap, and if ought implies can, or in other words, if morality is there saying this is what you really ought to do, and we find that we can't do it, right? We have sort of a problem, right? And so, how do you address that problem? How do you solve that gap? I think Christianity offers a really good explanation. So, in our approach, it's a fourfold approach in that way. Objective moral value and duties, yes. We sort of start where Craig starts, but then we extend it to moral knowledge and the two aspects of Kantian moral faith. And then very quickly, the other difference has to do with how are we going to couch the argument. And this is that difference between deductive and non-deductive approaches. So in the deductive approaches, like Craig's, you have this airtight case between the premises and the conclusion. What we do in our approach is a little bit different. We start with the evidence, and we don't ask the question, well, what's the only explanation of this evidence? That's an interesting question, but we're not always sure that it's the best question to ask. We think a little bit more of an epistemically modest approach might be instead to ask, well, what explains that evidence? And what explains that evidence well? What explains it really well? And perhaps even what's the best explanation? But we don't necessarily push it to what's the only explanation, or even more difficult would be to ask, what is the only possible explanation? Some people try to do that, and that's kind of a deductivism on steroids approach, But we just sort of shift away, and we either approach it inductively, where it's a more of a probabilistic matter, or abductively in terms of, well, what's the best this evidence? And honestly, often in conversation, I don't even need to push it that far. I'm like, where does that evidence, if you really closely attend to it, where does it sort of point? Right? And I think that it does gesture and drag people into a corner and say, on pain of irrationality, you have to accept that conclusion. I instead simply try to help people think about the implications of these truths that most people, believers and unbelievers, claim to believe in, and just sort of let that evidence work on them over time. And I think it will function as a sort of a nudge in that direction toward God, and that God can use that in people's lives. So, But on that point, I do just want to emphasize, I don't see the moral argument as about, here, I'm going to have this fight with you, and I'm going to show you how irrational you are unless you believe that God exists. And that's not a very good approach. We're trying to win people. We're not trying to make them feel bad if they don't agree with us. We're trying to get them to feel the force of the argument. You see what I'm saying? And so, be winsome about it, be ironic, be loving, kind, demonstrate principles, even as you talk about the argument or technique.
Yeah, that is actually a very good overview about the whole field of engaging with the moral argument. And now we'll be focusing more with your approach, the abductive approach. And in the past episode, we've covered the difference between deductive and inductive approach. And just a clarification for our listeners, back in that episode, in my preparation, I was overlapping between the inductive and abductive because of their non-deductive approach. But as a clarification, the inductive approach is where you lean towards more probabilistic way of looking at the explanation. And I've given an example of doing studies across people groups and understanding what causes a form of effect to come out, and the probabilistic conclusion that we would draw towards. Now, an abductive explanation or an abductive approach is when you infer to the best explanation. So inference to the best explanation is not inductive. I misspoke in that episode, but inference to the best explanation is abductive. And that is what Professor Dave's version of the moral argument presents with. Now, I'm just going to read out from your website a presentation of your version of the moral argument, sort of like a syllogism that you have put out there. So this is the
Before you do that, can I just interject something real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that you misspoke. There are some folks who see abduction as a variant, and they kind of conflate them. They just say, well, there's deductive approaches, non-deductive approaches, whether it's inductive or abductive. And well, what that relationship is between induction and abduction is something of a vexed question among folks. And it's not unheard of for some people to think of abduction as a variant of induction. So you might not have misspoke after all. But there's a kind of conceptual distinction there. I know we're going to talk about abduction mainly, but if I could say just a word about induction before we do. Richard Swinburne makes it this distinction between two kinds of induction. And it's a useful distinction. And so he says, look, there are two kinds of inductive arguments. One shows that your conclusion is more likely true than not. In other words, probably true. So you could give, say, an inductive moral argument where the conclusion is God probably exists. And he calls that a P-inductive argument, a P-inductive argument. But he also talks about a C-inductive argument that's less ambitious. And there, the conclusion is not necessarily likely true, but it's on the basis of the evidence that you're considering more likely true now that we've heard that evidence than it was. But that's maybe not all things considered likely true, but it gains some plausibility points as a result of these C-inductive arguments. And what Swinburne suggests is maybe you can put a bunch of C-inductive arguments together that can function as a P-inductive argument to demonstrate that your conclusion is actually more likely true than not. Anyway, that's fun stuff too, and we could talk about that another time if you want. We'll focus on abduction for now, though.
So, thank you for that clarification, and that has been an area of confusion within my friends in the apologetics field also, where we were confused for a while, and I realized that everyone with me was confused equally on, is there an overlap between induction and abduction? And so we realized that there is a slight variation. So we figured it's best to keep it at that for the audience to figure out the difference between induction and abduction. So this is the abductive version of the moral argument. Moral facts, moral knowledge, moral transformation, and moral rationality require robust explanation. The best explanation of these phenomena is God. And the concluding point is, therefore, God probably exists. So this is that non-deductive approach that Dr. Baggett was pointing us towards. Now, again, I will be dropping links in the description to Dr. Baggett's engagement more with this in a couple of articles on the moralapologetics.com website. But to give a quick overview, you've mentioned moral facts, moral knowledge, moral transformation, and moral rationality. Could you unpack what is meant by these four of these terms in under 2 minutes, so that this is something that we can refresh in our minds when we are approaching with this approach down the line for our audience?
Sure. Yeah. So again, we start with objective moral values and duties in a similar way that Craig does. And we point out things like the distinctive features of moral duties, which are going to be harder to account for on an atheistic kind of perspective, right? And the central feature of moral obligations that I think requires explanation is something like they possess authority, right, to dictate to us. If you have a duty to do something, right, your failure to do it kind of renders you morally guilty in an objective sort of sense. We're also trying to explain genuine moral duties, not mere feelings of duties. You can explain those in a way that's consistent with there being no duties, right? We want to talk about duties themselves. Those are going to be the hardest thing to explain. And then values, the particular moral value that I like to talk about is human value. I really think that that's something that speaks to a lot of people. If you think about, declarations of human rights and various things like that, it's often predicated on this idea that we as human beings the world over have this inexplicably great value. or even an infinitely great value or something like that. And I think that's a genuine insight that has come to us via, you might say, something like general revelation, natural theology. And then it just invites this question: well, why would we? Especially, suppose on a naturalistic understanding of things, we're just collocations of atoms and molecules. Why would we possess such value? Where would that come from? So that's another piece of moral evidence. Moral knowledge. This has to do with how is it, okay, even if there are these moral truths, how do we come to possess a knowledge of them, right? And this is a challenge, I think, especially for our secular friends, because, often the story told on their view is that we form the beliefs that we do on the basis of what is, say, evolutionarily successful at promoting our survival or something like that. But why would we come to possess knowledge of these moral truths? These sorts of so-called debunking objections to moral knowledge pose a challenge to our secular friends. They might come up with a pretty good answer, but I think that we, as theists and Christians, have just a particularly good answer because, on our view, God created us for reasons and purposes and gave us the faculties by which to recognize and apprehend these moral truths that He wants us to know, and then conduct our lives according to by His grace and such. And then again, the two dimensions of Kantian moral faith, the moral rationality bit and the moral transformation part. If there's not ultimate correspondence between what's in our self-interest and what morality dictates, then morality fails to be fundamentally rational. And so what is the account of the full rational stability of morality? Theism offers an excellent explanation for that. And then likewise, how is it that we can expect to see something like moral transformation? And not just that, I really think there are three deep existential moral needs that all of us have in this regard, because we fall short and there's that gap. We need forgiveness for our wrongdoing. We need to be changed and transformed, and we have to have some principled, realistic hope that can happen. And similarly, we want a principled, realistic hope that ultimately we can be completely transformed, even perfected. That's not going to happen in this life. But if there is an afterlife, and if there's a providential and loving God who will continue that process of transformation and complete it like the Bible promises, now we have a good, powerful, generally theistic, specifically Christian answer to all three of these deep existential moral needs: to be forgiven, to be changed, and ultimately even to be perfected. So this is what I call this argument from grace. And so those are the four major pieces of moral evidence, and they're not exhaustive, but they're the ones that Jerry and I in our work decided to focus on.
Yeah, and as you were mentioning, and especially the moral knowledge bit, I was just immediately reflecting back in my head that when we were covering through the Craig's version of the deductive approach, we were also at one point asking, how do we make sense of the fact that we humans evolved by pure naturalistic evolutionary mechanisms, and somehow we're supposed to make sense that these moral values exist independent of humans, but by chance, evolution brought about these sort of beings that are able to grasp or have this interaction with that moral realm. So there are a lot of these pieces that come together in a very unique fashion in the abductive approach that you put together, that may be interspersed across in maybe different versions. So each version has got its own strength and its own credibility in advancing and appealing to different crowds. Now, before I move into the next bit, we have around, I'm going to go on a leap and say we have another 30 minutes with us and have a lot to cover, but I'm conflicted within myself on what to ask, what not to ask. But to our audience, you would be listening to this podcast in the Easter weekend, March, at the end of March. And by that time, we would have released an Easter devotional on the YouVersion Bible app. Now, as with our previous devotional, this is going to be an apologetics infused devotional that helps you to walk through the devotional content that we would always meditate upon during the Easter weekend, but also provides you with easy to remember and short and succinct apologetics case making for the most transformative and the most ground-shaking event in human history, the tomb declared empty. And so head over to the YouVersion Bible plan, and it's for free, and we hope this will help you and edify you in your walk in faith. All right, now let's get back into the moral argument. Now, Professor Baggett, one thing that immediately stands off, and I think the next three sort of questions that I have are all connected along the same theme, but coming from different angles. One thing that stands out from between the deductive approach and the non-deductive or abductive approach is that the deductive approach, by its very nature of its syllogism, right, like you mentioned, if the logic holds and if the premises are true, then the conclusion inevitably follows. It's airtight. Now that brings a sense of certainty, like it interacts the force majeure to the listener. It is coming in with its wall closing. It's so direct, and that is sort of missed out, at least when I look at it, in the abductive approach. And that is a case with any sort of argument that uses the deductive style or an abductive or inductive style. So what is the benefit of that cost? We are losing a sense of that certainty when we are conveying the argument. So what offsets that loss of certainty in the syllogism?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I often do think that this is why folks think the deductive route is better to go, is a better way to go. But I think that it's based on a kind of a misunderstanding. So there is a sense of airtightness, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the conclusion of a deductive argument is necessarily true, even if the premises are more likely true than not. You would think if it's airtight, it would show, right? But that actually doesn't follow. And it has to do with, if true, yes, the conclusion is true. But usually in life, when we, look for the various pieces of, for the premises that we're considering, we don't know for sure that these things are true. We have some reason to believe that they're true, right? So they're maybe likely true or something like that. Now, I don't know if this will work, but I'll try this example from Tim McGrew. Okay, so when you play dice, you have a six-sided die. Now suppose I'm going to roll this die, and so it's going to come up either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So now consider this argument. When I roll the die, it's going to come up 1, 2, 3, or 4. Well, that's true, right? 2/3 likelihood it's going to be one of those 4 numbers out of the 6. Also, consider this other premise. When I roll it, it's going to be either 3, 4, 5, or 6. Well, that's likely true. Again, 2/3 likely true. Now, if you have those two premises, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And it's going to be 3, 4, 5, or 6. The conclusion is going to be, deductively, it's going to be either 3 or 4. They overlap, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So it's going to be either 3 or 4. But it's not likely true. Even though it's a deductive argument, that conclusion is not likely true, even though each premise is likely true. So in other words, there is often uncertainty built into your deductive arguments. And William Lane Craig himself has admitted this, right? That, the claim to certainty is a little misguided. Because embedded in the premises of most deductive arguments are elements of uncertainty. So when he says, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, well, we need an argument for that. And we need to really, figure out, well, is that true? And it's a kind of a tricky one, too, because suppose God exists necessarily. Now you're considering a premise that says, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But if God exists necessarily, that's a premise that's featuring the antecedent, the part after the if, which is utterly impossible. it would be like saying, if 2 + 2 = 5, then what follows, right? Well, who knows? I mean, it's an impossible scenario if God exists necessarily. So, yeah, it's a particularly what's called problematic counter-essential. It's not just a counterfactual, contrary to fact, it's contrary to possibility, that kind of challenge. So, I think that if you shift abduction, it does give you certain kind of advantages, and you're not really losing because there was already uncertainty to begin with. It was just embedded in the premises, and you can say, okay, well, here's a secular theory on offer to explain, say, human value or binding duties or something, and then here's the theistic account, and let's sort of compare and contrast these two accounts. And I don't necessarily have to say that the secular theory has nothing going for it. It might have some going for it, because oftentimes what our secular friends do, and understandably so, is appeal to features of the world in which we live. And this is a remarkable world. If we're right as theists, God created it. And it's inhabited by people like us who are, again, if Christianity is true, values of infinite dignity and value and worth. And our secular friends apprehend some of these truths, even in their fallen state, right?
Yeah,
They're creatures made in God's image themselves, and they have all sorts of, marvelous intellectual faculty to use, mental faculty to use, and so forth. And so, they may well be able to explain certain things, and they may well be able to get down that road of explanation to a certain degree. But then all that we have to do as theists is say, well, we have access to all of those resources that you guys are using because we live in the same world that you do in terms of the physical world. But we also think we have access to these additional resources and better, deeper, these moral phenomena. And some of these moral phenomena are going to be really difficult, fully and well and excellently to explain by secularists, whereas our explanations as Christians, I think, are a much better natural fit. So we're not saying, ours is the only explanation or the only possible explanation. We don't have to say that. We're just saying, well, look, I mean, it's a better explanation. We have principled reasons for thinking, and that's all that we need. Because if at the end of the day, all that we say from it is, morality taken seriously and looked at, it has given us some additional reasons to believe that God is real. I think that's enough. The moral argument doesn't have to do all the work in apologetics or natural theology, right? We have access to cosmological arguments and design arguments, arguments for the historicity of the resurrection, all kinds of arguments, and this is just one of them. And working in tandem with those other arguments, I think it's very, 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 very effective. So yeah, I mean, I think that as Christians and as apologists, we don't have to worry about every argument doing all the work. So we're not really losing much, I don't think, realistically construed here. This is just the way our minds work. We're considering a wide array of evidence, moral and non-moral, and seeing where that evidence leads, especially the cumulative effect of this evidence.
Yeah. And that was quite helpful. And my teammate at SAFT, Alan John, he's a doctor, not a PhD doctor, but a medicine doctor, and he asked me to check in with you one question, and it was him who, when we were interacting, it was him who for the first time told me that he finds the abductive approach that you put forward to be quite persuasive, as opposed to the deductive approach, and that got me more thinking about the different approaches that is engaged within this argumentative field. And the question that he put forward is that again, it comes back to the point of the sense of certainty that we get with the deductive approach, and it primarily has to do with that. We spend quite a lot of our time speaking to crowds, delivering these talks to very lay audience, and so we realize that there is again that sense of perceived certainty that the deductive approach brings to it. And so he was asking, well, what can we do to make the abductive approach more palatable for the crowd? The deductive approach has that straightforward syllogism going for it, and You put that forward and the audience is able to follow along. Or even if you take Alvin Plantinga's version, which says, if there are objective moral duties, then God exists. Premise 2, there are objective moral duties. Conclusion, so God exists. That sort of cuts, like we discussed, it's straightforward, cutthroat, neat and clean. So his question is more practical. What can we do? Like when we take the abductive approach, what can we do to make the approach more palatable for a lay audience? And the first thing that's coming to my mind is that in this abductive approach, we are granting from a common ground. I mean, like I said, we're not asking them to assume what we are not assuming what it is to be if God were not to exist, right? We are starting off from the common ground that objective moral values and duties do exist. Okay, so now what best explains them? That's the common ground that we are starting with. And I think that is a great way to put forward the idea. But what other sort of practical tip or insight would you give to someone who wants to bring the abductive approach to a lay audience so that they can grasp it better?
Yeah. One thing I want to say is, you might not have the time, because if we're saying in certain contexts, right, if we're saying theism provides the best explanation, now that means it can take on every comer, right? I mean, it can defeat every alternative explanation, and how on earth are you going to have the time to do that, right? So maybe in a book or a series of books, but how in one, and that's why I said in some contexts, the pithier approach might have a certain kind of advantage. And there's nothing wrong with that. Beyond that, I want to point out a similarity between the two approaches in the abductive. The format, okay, you could give Craig's version in this form. Objective moral values and duties exist. There's your common ground. It starts out the same place as ours. But then his goes, if God doesn't exist, those wouldn't exist. And instead, what we're saying is, what best expresses things is something like God. You're going to have to spend some amount of time defending either premise. But if you can, in a pithy sort of way, encapsulate this counter-essential, that if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist, you could probably, with a little bit of work, come up with a few things to say by way of defending this idea that evidentially these moral data, powerful as they are, evidentially point toward something like a transcendent explanation, an explanation like God. Maybe you want to talk about the personal nature of morality, or maybe you want to talk about the value of human beings and then point to, this idea that we've been made in God's image, which would provide a ready explanation for why it is we have such value. Or you want to talk about the authority of morality and where that would come from and how that would be strange and difficult, sort of, maybe not impossible, but, much more difficult on a secular understanding. Whereas on a theistic understanding, God created us and he loved us and he created us for reasons, purposes, and after his likeness, and wants because they're going to draw us to him and enable us to know him better and become more like him in the process. And it will facilitate love of neighbor and love of God and help us to reach our telos and, our fulfillment that we were designed for as human beings. You know what I mean? You can point to these things and gesture at them without necessarily saying all that you are able to say if you have more time. So I think ultimately, I mean, it probably wouldn't matter. Depending on the level of generality that you want to provide, you could, in broad compass, give an aerial kind of perspective. And then if you want to have those more fine-grained discussions, which you should, you can. But then if you're involved in engaged, say, in a dialogue with a single individual, and you want to apply the abductive approach, here's the nifty part. You don't necessarily have to say, let me take on all comers, and show why the theistic explanation is better than each and every possible one. That's a big task. But let's suppose you're an atheist and I'm talking to you. I could just say, well, tell me your view. I'm curious how you might try to explain duties, and then I get your specific view, and then I delimit the conversation with you in a very personal, intimate way, just to that specific concrete approach. And then it becomes a more manageable conversation, you see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very relevant point, in that oftentimes when we engage with someone who is seeking the truth, it doesn't always happen in a 5 minutes presentation. It takes conversation, spending time, working through with them, engage with their doubts. And that is a great place to put the abductive approach into practice. Sitting there and asking, okay, what do you think makes sense? What do you think fits towards the whole pieces? And we can work in moral values and moral duties for someone who is more familiar with one version of a deductive approach. We can spend time to factor that in, but then taking an inference to the best explanation, a conversational path to working it through, than just simply being stuck with those syllogisms per se, feeling like they have to work through premise 1 and 2 before they ever get to the conclusion. And I think that sort of combination brings in that sort of subjective flair to engaging and modifying it and adapting as the situation needs, making us to be more on the feet ambassadors for the gospel. And the great point that stands out is that almost every objection that we encounter about the faith is almost always about the moral issue. If God exists, why is there evil? It's one of the best, and that is one of the most prominent questions. And we see that in so many different instances, the issue is always about a moral factor. A moral issue is at play. And that's why I believe that the moral argument continues to have that sort of attention towards it, because it tries to make sense of one of the deepest questions in our life, the values that we hold, why we do things the way we do. And even in different domains. I am a postgraduate in economics. And so when you were talking about moral rationality, all the bells started whistling in my head about self-interest maximization and rationality in economics. And we see a lot of overlap. Economics started off as moral philosophy, the question of how should we conduct ourselves, how should we conduct our dealings with money and economy and all as such. And again, we see that influence there. How should we do it? I mean, is it okay if you cut some corners and make some profit as long as you are minimizing cost? But is it not okay? Well, then now that's morality creeping in, moral philosophy creeping in. And so it has that sway on so many different domains, in ethics, bioethics, so many different ways. And one strength that I'm seeing, one very key strength that I'm seeing in your formulation style is that it is pointing specifically towards the Christian message. While a very common way of deductive approach that Craig or Planning Us versions would do is, it leaves it a theism, and there are still a lot more questions to be answered, lot more of ex post facto analysis to be done to then bridge it from there to the gospel message. But the point that you bring about moral transformation, right, and the idea about that moral gap, the Immanuel Kant's way of that moral gap, the argument from grace and as such, it all points more directly towards the gospel message, more directly towards the need that's incumbent upon us, not to just stick by some moral duties, but something much more. And that's what stuck out to me when I was reading through Kant's argument from grace, and that he mentioned this portion. He says that, and it's all again mentioned in your website. Again, I'm linking it into the description. Exaggerating human capacities, lowering the moral demand, or finding a secular form of assistance are inadequate for the purpose of closing that moral gap, the place that we ought to be, and like you said, the place that we are not. And it struck me so fascinatingly that if we ever were to come up with an explanation to say that this is somehow a projection of our human existence, that this moral understanding is purely, utterly granted and based in us, right? Purely an evolutionary survivalistic drive, why is there that gap? Why is there this gap that we humans are so incapable to reach out to? I mean, we are projecting a demand on ourselves that we humans are absolutely incapable. And I was just thinking through some of the great names in history, be it from India's Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. We take out their lives and there is at least one place where we would say, not perfect. I mean, he came so close, but not perfect. And we can see that the demand that we have on morality is so vastly superior that we humans can't attain it. And that to me strikes to me says, well, this looks like this is out of this world. This moral demand is not at all human. This is something from beyond this world. I think that's a very fascinating thought. So I will just invite you to comment on Immanuel Kant's that observation of that moral gap, the demand for moral transformation, how it leads to the gospel, as we come to the conclusion of this very fascinating conversation.
Oh, yeah, sure. Right. I was following John Hare's lead on that. emphasis on transformation, right? Because it offered this hope that the gap could be closed, right? Yeah, and it was Hare following Kant who came up with those three things. You can lower the demand, or you can exaggerate our powers, and those don't really seem to be the right thing to do, right? Because morality really isn't negotiable, right? There are these inviolable standards, and try as we might, we're just not good enough to get up to that. And I mean, in fact, let's face it. I mean, human beings have a horrible track record of doing really atrocious things, right? I mean, if you look at the history of the world, I mean, it's one genocide after another the world over. I mean, it's really hard to look at. But it's true that we are, we're infinitely valuable as human beings, but we're not particularly good. We're susceptible to all kinds of moral weaknesses, and it's quite discouraging. And what keeps us from despair is at least the hope that something could fix us, and not just change us, but forgive us for the wrongdoing and transform us, and ultimately even hold out this realistic hope for perfection. And what finally dawned on me was this is really Christianity in a nutshell, right? I mean, the order of salvation goes from justification that has to do with forgiveness, to sanctification that has to do with transformation, to glorification that has to do with ultimate perfection. And God promises, I'm going to finish the good work within you that I have begun, and I'm going to complete it at the day of Christ Jesus. I mean, the idea is that this isn't Pollyannish wishful thinking that we're going to eventually arrive at that destination. It's a glorious promise that we are given as Christians, and it satisfies that deep felt existential moral need for realistic hope. So for all three of these things, so it was at that point that it dawned on me, this is actually not just generally the theism we're talking about. I mean, it's something very specific to Christianity. And so and Craig and I have had a conversation about this. And he actually kind of wants to keep it at the level of theism. He thinks, we can use the historicity arguments for the resurrection for something more specifically Christian. But I'm not so sure that we don't have something more distinctively Christian by way of moral resources. I do think that in terms of this performative argument from grace, there is something in Christianity that neatly corresponds with these three felt existential moral needs. And there's a nice overlap there, I think, between where philosophy leads us, you might say, and where theology leads us. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's not the only way, potentially to argue for something distinctively Christian. My friend Adam Johnson has written a book on metaethics and God and ethics, where he pushes it beyond theism per se to Christianity via the role that the Trinity plays. And C.S. Lewis intimated this once when he talked about when we say God is love, what does that mean? If God is a purely unitary being, what would it mean to say that God is love? But if God is Trinitarian, and the Father, the Son, and the Spirit exist in what theologians call this perichoretic or self-giving mutual relationship between these three persons, then before there was ever a world, God himself was this three-in-one Trinity, exemplifying, manifesting, perfectly exemplifying self-giving love. And that's a beautiful picture. And so I think there's much to be said along those lines. I haven't focused on that as much in my own work, but I'm excited about it. And I think there's more really groundbreaking work to be done in extending something like moral variance of the argument for God's existence to something more distinctively Christian.
Wow. And that is a perfect end to what has been a really fascinating and enjoyable conversation on the moral argument, and also really a lot of points to take back as we continue to ponder on how we can present the argument in the best way possible, not to win arguments, but to win souls, so that we may point towards the one whom we preach, Christ crucified. Thank you, Professor Baggett, for taking your time out of your busy schedule and being on SAFT Podcast. It was a true pleasure to have you on.
Oh, it was such a joy. I really appreciate the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Professor. And so I will be dropping again a reminder in the link to in the description, the link to Professor Dave Baggett's website, Moral Apologetics, and you will find a link to all of his works and the books that he has contributed. And we look forward to more work coming from your end, especially the combined work with Dr. Craig as well. And so do check it out. And also, this is the final episode, as I mentioned, of our bit in the Natural Theology series on the moral argument. And so with that, we will be concluding the moral argument with this episode. We will be taking a break, and we will be having some exciting guest interactions coming up in the next couple of episodes. So do say subscribe and keep in the loop as we have that rolling out, and then we will resume the Natural Theology series with another argument. So until then, take care and God bless.